Hello everyone, and yes, I am showing the game today instead of yesterday. It is the Armageddon game between Magnus Carlsen and Maxime Vachier-Lagrave. They repeated the Gruenfeld from the classical section, but Maxime found an improvement on their classical game and the game took a new turn. It's a very interesting one, so you guys will enjoy it. It's super complicated, and unfortunately, Armageddon is just not enough time for positions that arise in this game. So Magnus has the white pieces, and if you haven't seen it, do check out the classical game so you would understand the completely new game part a little bit better. So here we have d4 by Magnus, knight to f6. Sorry about that. We have c4, everything the same as in the classical game, g6 going for the king's Indian defense, knight c3, d5, captures, and again e4, captures, and Magnus goes, after bishop to g7, Magnus goes for this, like we mentioned in the previous video, fourth most popular line, bishop to b5 check. We have c6, Magnus has to retreat with the bishop, and Maxime gets all this expansion on the queen side, knight f3, castles, and now Magnus also castles. We have a4, bishop to c2, and c5. So everything the same as in the classical game, rook to b1. And here in the classical section, Maxime continued with bishop to g4. However, after the game, of course, both of them most likely check the engine to prepare something special if the positions repeat, and he plays knight to c6. Now, the engine only slightly prefers knight to c6 over bishop to g4, but it is enough for Maxime to create a completely new game, and this is where we take a new turn. The game is now completely different from the classical game, which of course makes sense as we have a completely new game. So here Magnus has to decide whether to play d5 or e5, and that's always an unpleasant choice when facing the Gruenfeld. If you don't know it by heart, then you will just push a pawn. And here we have e5. It's okay to push both of the pawns depending on what kind of a game you want to have. So here we have e5, rook to b8, and now bishop to e4. Going after the knight here, similar like he did in the classical section, we have bishop to f5 now, attacking the bishop, and of course if you capture the knight, then you blunder the rook on b1. So bishop captures, allowing the doubling of the f-pawn, but as you'll see, the position will be quite solid. So g captures on f5, queen to d3 going after the pawn, and now queen to d7 defending. We have rook to d1, putting a rook on the maybe soon to be opened the d file, and rook f to d8. Maxime does the same. We have bishop to f4, and now c captures, and pawn to e6. So it's a very solid structure, equal material. Maxime does have a doubled f pawn, but maybe you can at some point maybe move the king, put the rooks on the g file, have some sort of an attack, and also the d4 pawn is a backwards pawn. So Maxime, at some point, if he piles up on it, it will be very, very hard to defend it. And let's not forget, it's Armageddon, so it's Magnus who needs to push for a win here in order to win the match. So bishop g5 kicks away the rook from the d file, rook d to c8, and now queen to e3. Now with ideas of bishop h6 or maybe even bishop to f6, we have knight to e7, and now Magnus goes for this bishop trade, bishop to f6. Bishop to h6 is a bit more precise as it prevents h6, and h6 is a very nice resource for Maxime as it prevents queen to g5. So this is what Maxime plays. We have h6, queen to f4, now preparing queen g3 and checkmate, if Maxime allows it, of course. Knight to, not that, sorry about that, knight to g6, and now queen to g3. We have king to h7, getting the king away from the g file, and now Magnus plays pawn to d5, and this is just a wonderful move. It's a question whether to play it right away or to first maybe start push the h pawn, because you can maybe always play this, but it's Armageddon. You don't have all the time in the world, and Maxime has very little time on the clock. So Magnus doesn't want to let Maxime think. And what this move does is it frees up the d4 square for the knight, but also what it does is it frees up the entire fourth rank, so you can make a rook lift, rook to b4, and bring the rook into the attack. E captures on d4, d5, and now you could play knight d4, you could play knight h4, but Magnus goes for the immediate rook to b4, preparing this rook lift, because of course if the knight captures, then queen g7 will be checkmate, but Maxime stops it, rook to c4, and now Magnus trades, rook captures, b captures, of course not d captures, you don't want to hang your queen, and now pawn to e6. This is what Magnus found when he played that d5 move, attacking the queen and the rook. And now if this was I believe anyone except Maxime, we would see queen c8, just defending the rook, and the game continues. Maybe bishop captures on g7, maybe king captures, or maybe even better f4. First we challenge the queen, forcing the queen to the light square diagonal, and after queen g4, king captures on g7, now making the capture on f7 or pushing the pawn impossible, as the queen on g4 would hang. But here Maxime just captures the pawn. He says, you can have the rook. I'm Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, I always give up the rook. Okay, queen captures on b8, Magnus takes it, it is the strongest move, bishop captures on f6, and now rook to e1, attacking the queen, queen to d7, and now queen to b6. So it's not easy for Magnus to play this, especially since he's the one who needs to push this for a win, but Maxime just can't stop himself. He has the black pieces in Armageddon, and he's playing for a win. It's just the kind of player Maxime is. He now has two connected pass pawns, and he is ready to push them. So king to g7 first, we have g3, creating a little bit of breathing room for the king here, and now we have pawn to f4. Here d4 is incredibly strong. If you can get this d4 and d3 in, your position just becomes much better, but Maxime is incredibly low on time here, so he plays f4 first. He realizes that there is a possibility of a piece sacrifice that would allow him to get a perpetual check and force a draw. So here, queen to c5. Now Magnus says, all right, you didn't want to push d4, you're not pushing it now, because then the c4 pawn hangs. And here we have f captures on g3. With this move, Maxime frees up the f4 square for the knight. Queen to f4, f5 still allows Maxime to push a little bit harder. For example, king g2, h4, h5, h4, and so on. But okay, f captures on g3. Maxime knows what he's doing. H captures, and now comes the move, knight to f4. If he didn't go for this, he could just push the pawn. It will be nicely defended on c3. But now, if Magnus actually captures the pawn, then queen g4 check, and you will pick up the knight. King f1. Let's say queen captures on f3, and you have all of these light squares that you can use to deliver check to the white king, and it will be very hard, or rather impossible, to get out of all the checks. But instead we have queen to e3. Magnus of course doesn't capture the knight, and now we have knight to d3. By not capturing the knight and allowing this perpetual, Magnus has to go into a worse position. Now comes knight to d3, rook to b1, and now we have queen to e6, offering a queen trade. And this is, again, you have to play d4 and depending on where the queen goes, push the pawn to c3 and so on before offering the queen trade. But here Maxime trades the queen right away, rook to b7, and now queen captures on e3. We have f captures and pawn to c3. And now, okay, you are a little bit better here, but now you're playing an endgame against Magnus, and you are very low on time, so that's never a sure thing. So here, rook to c7. Magnus absolutely has to prevent this pawn from reaching c2. If it reaches c2, c1 is covered, so that's game over. Knight to b4, now guarding the c2 pawn, c2 square, also attacking the a2 pawn. But now Magnus has time to activate his pieces, or rather the king, and he should play king to f2. But he plays knight to e1, and this is now a problem, because it allows Maxime this beautiful tactic, bishop to e5. And okay, you're attacking the rook, you're attacking the g3 pawn, Magnus just moves the rook, but now the problem is, because the knight is on e1, bishop captures on g3 comes with an attack on the knight, and Magnus does not have time to capture the c3 pawn. So king f1, he has to waste a move. Now comes the bishop captures on e1. Again, knight captures on a2, also always an option. Bishop captures, king captures, and now knight captures on a2, defending the pawn here. And now Magnus is up the exchange, but Maxime is up 4 pawns, which is quite a lot. So here, king to d1, pawn to a3. We have rook to b8 and pawn to h5. Now this pawn starts marching forward as well. King to c2. We have pawn to h4 and rook to b1. So the knight is now cut off from the game, and the king to b3 will win the knight. But again, Maxime has all of these extra pawns. So king f6, we have king to b3, and now here comes the magic moment. Maxime should play something like king to e5 or king to g5, just bring the king closer, pick up this pawn, or even play c2. This is pretty much a forced draw. Let's say king captures on c2 because we are threatening to capture the rook and also to promote. So king captures. Now we gain some time because our knight remains in the game, and now after he goes after this, king e4, king captures on a2, and now you have plenty of pawns and you will get a draw here. There's nothing that white can do to prevent you from getting the king here and pushing this pawn. King captures on a3, just king f2, and white will have to resort to perpetual checks here. However, Maxime played knight to b4, and it's the weirdest move ever. But it's not, it's easily dismissible as a blunder. It is a blunder, but no one realizes it's a blunder except for Magnus. Magnus captures the knight right away, and he says, now you're not getting a draw. Now I'm just gonna beat you. And here we have pawn to a2, and this is the problem. This is the position that obviously neither of them thought possible, because there are winning moves here, and there of course are drawing moves here, and there of course are losing moves here. So feel free to pause the video and try to figure out the moves that are winning here for white while I give you a couple of seconds. So for those of you who were able to do it, congratulations on spotting this, because it's not easy. And for those of you who just want to enjoy the show, rook to a1, leaving the rook on b1, rook to c1, and the rook to d1 are not good moves. If you do this, you are not winning the game as white, or even rook to e1. However, rook to f1, rook to g1, and rook to h1 are winning for white. So that's pretty incredible. Now, in the game, Magnus played rook to a1, and of course, we're going to show what happens here. But just to give you an example, you could play between the three, we're gonna go to f1 as this one comes with check, so it makes sense. And also there's a pawn on f7. So let's explore this. What happens? Okay, king g5. Of course, black wants to get the king here and push this pawn. We're gonna play king b3, king to g4, and now king captures on a2. This pawn is a priority. h3, we're gonna play rook captures on f7, and now after king to g3, king to b3, pawn to h2, now we cover the queening square, rook to h7, king to g2, and now king captures on c3. And now after h1 queen, we're gonna capture the queen, king captures, and now finally king to d4. We win the game, but only by a tempo. King g2, king captures on d5, and now if the black king was already here, he could just gobble up the pawn, but he's gonna play king f3. Now we push e4, our pass pawn is protected, and we are winning this game. So that's one way to do it. However, Magnus played rook to a1, and now the position is no longer winning, because here Maxime plays c2, and now the situation is much different. We have king to c3, now comes pawn to h3. Here we have king captures on c2, and here, incredible as it is, Maxime played king to g5, and after king to d3, he was in this position on move 54 that Maxime Vachier-Lagrave resigned the game, but he also lost on time. Basically, when he resigned, he had 0-0-0. I guess he saw that he was on a few seconds on the clock, and then he just decided to resign, as there now really is nothing more you can do here, and Maxime knows that this is winning for Magnus. However, there was, instead of king to king to f5, instead of king to g5 that was played in the game, king to f5 is a draw. Incredible, but endgames are just spectacular in that way. So the reason why this is so, sorry, not this king f5. Yeah, this king f5. The reason is after king to d3 here, now we're gonna play pawn to h2. That's the good stuff. And now after, let's say, king to d4, going after the pawn, we're gonna play f6. After king captures on d5, we're gonna play king to g4. After king to e4, we're gonna play pawn to f5 with check. King back to d4, now king to f3. Notice that white can never capture the pawn because black will just queen the h pawn. King to d3, now we're gonna play f4. We get rid of white's pass pawn. Pawn captures here, king captures, king e2, and now king to g3, and there is no way, there is no good way to prevent king to g2. If king to e3, king to g2, and now how are you stopping rook to h1? You have to resort to rook captures on a2 with check, and after king g1, rook a1 check, king g2, and you're gonna have to repeat, otherwise black will just get a queen into the game. So this is how you draw. The problem is after king to g5, this is tempo not well spent. The problem is after king to d3, the moment when Maxime resigned the game, you don't have a good continuation. If you just play king to f5, we have the exact same position like we did in the previous line, only it's white to move. Black lost the tempo, and now it's completely winning. Rook captures on a2, and your king is too far behind. King g4, we're going to play rook to f2 now, and after king g3, we gobble up the f7 pawn, king g2, rook h7, and now again after h2, just king d4, and we have a similar position to the one that we've already discussed. h1 queen, we're going to captures, and now you are too far behind to stop the pass pawn from queening and winning. And the other thing, if you don't want to repeat king to f5 because you've already played king to g5, you could continue king g4, but now we don't go after the d pawn. Now we play the spectacular king to e2. This is, of course, with so little time on the clock, not easy to find, but the point is after king to g3, there's rook to g1, and now you either force the black king back, and then of course the white is completely winning, or he goes forward and then you play king f2, completely locking the king in, and now black has no other moves other than pushing the pawns. And once all the pawns have been pushed, let's say rook to a1, we're going to play d4, e captures on d4, f4, we have to waste all the moves. We can even capture on a2, and now after king h1, we're going to play d5, f3, let's say king to g3, and now we just checkmated the black king. Pawn to f2, rook to a1 with check, f1, probably a queen, and rook captures on f1 will be checkmate. So that's how incredible endgames are, and why you should always study the endgame before, you know, even having breakfast. Yeah, after king to d3, Maxime resigned, and he also lost on time, and Magnus Carlsen wins the game. Incredibly complicated, which is a shame for Maxime. He was winning in classical, had two clear winning opportunities, but if you've seen the previous video, you know how they were incredibly difficult to spot, and here again Maxime was much better, but when it was crucial to start pushing those pawns, he hesitated, and that was enough. He gave Magnus, if he just before trading queens, for example, played those d4 and c3 moves, then his pawns would be too far ahead, and Magnus would there would be nothing else to do. But here he gave Magnus a slightly worse endgame to play, and but with more time on the clock, and that was enough for Magnus to play this. So sorry for a bit of a longer video on an Armageddon game, but it's such a complicated endgame that even by showing only a few lines, we've you know, explored quite a lot. So yeah, here are the standings, as I know you guys really enjoyed those. After the penultimate round, Magnus Carlsen leading the tournament with 15 points. We have Shahriar Mamedjarov with 14.5 in second, Vishwanathan Anand in third place with 13, and Maxime Vachier-Lagrave in fourth place with 12.5. And I think only 4 of them are contending for first place, as a winning classical gives you 3 points. So I believe even maybe in some scenario Maxime can win, but you know, not so sure. However, Anand, Mamedjarov, and Magnus can still. All 3 of them are sure that they can win it. Then we have Wesley So and Anish in 11, Veselin Topalov with 8.5, Aryan Tari 8.5, Wang Hao 6.5, and Temur Rajabov 6.5. So hope you enjoyed the standings as well. We'll see what the final round brings. And of course, I would like to thank Charles Huff, Nagarjuna Punugoti, Timu Salo, Adrian Marcin Nagorski, and Benjamin Bogwald for a contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot. I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you soon, continuing the coverage of this magnificent tournament until it finishes. So see you soon, and you know, hope you have an excellent rest of your day. And it's really a shame that another Gruenfeld, such you know, played with such elegance, did not result in more than a draw in classical and a loss in Armageddon. But yeah, that's chess. See you soon.